January 28th, 1856, Cincinnati, Ohio. A mother's hand trembling as she held a butcher knife, warm blood pooling on the cold floorboards. Margaret Garner, 22 years old, an enslaved woman and mother of 4, had just cut the throat of her 2-year-old daughter Mary rather than see her dragged back into slavery. The knife, still slick with her daughter's blood, caught the pale winter light filtering through the window of the small house on Mill Creek Road, where she had sought freedom for 17 desperate days. It was not madness, it was not surrender. It was a mother's final act of love in a world that had stripped her of every other choice, every other mercy. Margaret Garner had decided that death was kinder than slavery, that the grave was softer than the slave auction. Before we continue this story of unimaginable courage and desolation, leave a comment telling us where you're from and what time it is there. Don't forget to subscribe to hear more untold stories of resistance and survival. Morning light crept slowly across the frozen Ohio River, casting long shadows over the ice-covered banks that separated Kentucky from Ohio, slavery from freedom, hope from despair. The air was sharp with the January cold, thick with the smoke of 100 chimneys, heavy with the burden of secrets whispered in the dark. Snow had fallen the night before, muffling the sounds of the waking city, creating a silence that felt like the world holding its breath. Across the river, just 17 days earlier, Margaret Garner had run through the night with her 4 children and her husband Robert, their feet leaving desperate tracks in the snow, their lungs burning with the cold air, and something that might have been hope. Behind them, Richwood Station Plantation in Boone County, Kentucky, stretched its tendrils of memory, cotton fields browned with winter stubble, slave quarters that smelled of fear and resignation, and the overseer's whip that sang its familiar song over bowed backs and lowered heads. But here, in this small house on Mill Creek Road, owned by her husband's cousin, Elijah Kite, a free black man who had risked everything to shelter them, Margaret had experienced 17 days of something she had never known. She watched her children, 8-year-old Thomas, with his father's steady eyes, 6-year-old Samuel, quick to laugh despite all he had seen, 2-year-old Mary, still small enough to believe in safety, and baby Scylla, 9 months old and born into slavery. She watched them sleep without fear, wake without dread, eat without wondering if it would be their last meal together. She moved like steam, slow, silent, necessary. Her hands, scarred by years of cotton picking and kitchen burns, moved with a grace that spoke of survival. Margaret had learned long ago that in the world of slavery, a woman's body belonged to her master. Her children could be sold with less ceremony than cattle, and her dreams were luxuries that could be forcibly ripped from her if she wasn't careful to keep them hidden. The house on Mill Creek Road was small, 3 rooms that seemed like a palace to people who had slept on dirt floors and straw pallets. There was a kitchen with a real stove, not just a fire pit. There were windows with glass, not just shutters. There were beds with blankets that belonged to no master, chairs where a woman could sit without permission, and doors that locked from the inside. For 17 days, Margaret had lived in the space between slavery and freedom, suspended like dust motes in a sunbeam. She cooked meals for her family without an overseer, timing how long it took her. She nursed baby Scylla without worrying that someone might snatch the child away to sell her. She watched Robert plan their journey north, to Canada, where slavery could not reach them, where their children could learn to read and write, where they could own land and speak their minds and walk with their heads held high. But freedom, Margaret had learned, was not a river you crossed just once. It was a country you had to fight for every day, defend with every breath, and sometimes choose death instead of its loss. That morning, January 28th, the knock on the door came like thunder, strong, insistent, carrying with it the weight of law and custom and the particular cruelty of men who made their living hunting other human beings. Margaret's blood ran cold in her veins. She knew that sound. She had heard it in nightmares, in the whispered stories among enslaved women, in the hollow echoes of her own heart when she dared to dream of freedom. They had been found. Margaret's story began 22 years earlier, in 1834, when she drew her first breath in the slave quarters of Richwood Station. Her mother, Priscilla, had died when Margaret was still young enough to believe that mothers were permanent fixtures in the world, like the sun or the moon or the endless rows of cotton that stretched beyond the horizon. Her father was a white man whose name she had never known, whose face she sometimes saw in her own reflection, whose blood gave her the light skin that made her valuable in ways that cut deeper than any whip. She was raised by other women in the slave quarters, women whose own children had been sold, who poured their truncated motherhood into any child who would accept it. They taught her to keep her eyes down and her voice soft, to work hard enough to avoid the whip, but not so hard as to set an impossible standard for others. They taught her to read the moods of white men like weather patterns, when to disappear, when to smile, when to make herself as small and insignificant as dust. But Margaret learned other lessons too. In the dark hours before dawn, when the slave quarters buzzed with whispered conversations, she learned about Denmark Vesey and Nat Turner, about the underground, railroad that moved like a secret river beneath the surface of the South, about places called Canada and England, where black skin was not a crime and freedom was not a fantasy. When she was 14, she was given to Robert Garner, another enslaved person on the Gaines plantation. It was not a marriage in any legal sense. Enslaved people could not marry, could not make contracts, could not promise each other forever in a world where forever could be ended with a bill of sale. But Robert was kind, and Margaret learned to love him as one loves something beautiful and fragile, always aware that it could be taken away. Robert had dreams bigger than cotton fields. He spoke of freedom the way other men spoke of women or whiskey, with a hunger that could not be sated by anything else. He had learned to read by trading food for lessons with a poor white boy, and he taught Margaret the letters by scratching them in the dirt with sticks, tracing them on her palm in the dark, whispering their sounds like endearments. Her silence was not always surrender. Sometimes it was a storm waiting for a crack in the sky. Margaret bore 4 children in 8 years. Each birth was a celebration and a terror. Joy at bringing life into the world, horror at bringing black life into a world that considered it property. She watched Thomas grow from an infant to a boy who asked questions she couldn't answer. Why can't I learn to write my name? Why do white children play while we work? Why does Mama cry when she thinks no one is looking? The breaking point came in January 1856, when Archibald Gaines, their master, announced he was selling Robert to a plantation in Alabama. The words hit Margaret like a physical blow. Alabama meant cotton fields that stretched to hell and back. Alabama meant Robert disappearing into the vast maw of the deep South, never to be seen again. Alabama meant raising Haiti, her children alone, watching them grow without their father, watching them sold off one by one until she had nothing left but memories and grief. That night, Robert came to her with a plan that sounded like madness and felt like salvation. They would escape, all of them. They would cross the Ohio River in the dead of winter, go to his cousin Elijah's house in Cincinnati, and from there continue north to Canada, where slavery could not reach them. Margaret looked at her children. Thomas trying with all his might to be the man his father wouldn't be there to teach him to become. Samuel with his infectious laugh that could light up the darkest day. Mary still small enough to sleep in her arms. Baby Scylla, who had known nothing but love and perhaps still had a chance at freedom. The risk was enormous. Fugitive enslaved people were hunted like animals, beaten when caught, sometimes killed as examples to others, but the alternative was a slow death of the soul, watching her family disintegrate piece by piece until nothing was left but the shell of what they had been. She was not broken. She was burning, slow, controlled, waiting. They began to plan with the methodical care of people who knew they would only get one chance. Robert studied patrol routes, learned which guards drank too much and slept too deeply, identified the safest crossing point on the river. Margaret gathered supplies, food that wouldn't spoil, clothes that would keep the children warm, the few precious items that connected them to their past. She sewed coins into the lining of her dress, money earned doing extra laundry, selling eggs from chickens she wasn't supposed to have, trading small favors for copper pennies. On the night of January 11th, 1856, they fled to freedom. The temperature was below zero, the river partially frozen, but not solid enough to walk on. Robert found a small boat, and they launched themselves onto the dark water with their 4 children and Margaret's hope wrapping around them like a prayer. Thomas helped his father, Rojikio Amila, while Margaret held the 2 youngest children, their breath visible in the frigid air, their hearts beating so loudly she was sure the sound would reach Kentucky and betray them. They made it across. They reached Elijah Kite's house. For 17 days they lived in the space between slavery and freedom, tasting what life could be like if they were truly free. But freedom, Margaret had learned, was not a place you arrived at. It was something you had to fight for every day, defend with every breath, and sometimes choose death to preserve. Archibald Gaines was a man who wore his cruelty like a tailored coat, carefully fitted, impeccably maintained, displayed with pride. 43 years old, with greying hair and cold blue eyes that missed nothing, he owned Richwood Station and the 73 human beings who worked there. He prided himself on being a reasonable master, which meant he only used the whip when he deemed it necessary, only separated families when it was profitable, only raped his enslaved women when his wife visited her sister in Louisville. Gaines had inherited the plantation from his father, along with the conviction that slavery was not merely an economic necessity, but a moral good, a way to civilize an inferior race, bring them to Christianity, teach them the value of hard work. He read his Bible every morning and found in it justification for everything he did, every lash he ordered, every child he sold, every woman he violated. To him, Margaret and Robert were not people, but investments, valuable property that had appreciated over time and could be liquidated when cash flow demanded. When he discovered they had fled, his anger was not the hot fury of personal betrayal, but the cold anger of a businessman who had been robbed. He immediately contacted Bennett Butts, a slave catcher who specialized in tracking fugitives across the Ohio River. Butts was a lean, bony man with tobacco-stained teeth and hands that seemed familiar with violence. He charged $50 per enslaved person captured, plus expenses, and had never failed to bring back his quarry. Butts brought 2 deputies with him, Marshal Hiram Robinson, a federal officer who enforced the Fugitive Slave Act with the zeal of a man who believed he was doing God's work, and James Marshall, a local Cincinnati policeman who supplemented his income by helping return runaway enslaved people to their masters. Robinson was a large man with a red face and hands like pig hocks, who spoke with the drawling accent of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. Marshall was younger, hungrier, the kind of man who saw every runaway enslaved person as money slipping through his fingers. Together, these four men represented the full weight of law and custom that upheld slavery. Gaines provided the legal documents of ownership. Butts provided the tracking skills and local knowledge. Robinson held federal authority that superseded state and local law. Marshall knew Cincinnati's black neighborhoods, knew which doors might hide runaway enslaved people, knew which white families might be foolish enough to harbor fugitives. They searched for 17 days, following a trail that led from Kentucky across the frozen Ohio River to the Mill Creek settlement in Cincinnati. Butts had interrogated other enslaved people, offering rewards for information, making threats when rewards failed. He had spoken with boat operators along the river, checked his network of informants, gradually narrowing his search until he was sure the Garners were hidden somewhere in the Mill Creek area. The breakthrough came when a neighbor noticed smoke coming from Elijah Kite's chimney at unusual hours, saw shadows moving behind curtains at times when the house should have been empty. The neighbor, a white man named Patrick, who resented having free black people in his neighborhood, contacted the authorities and received a $5 reward for his information. She named them one by one, like curses whispered in the dark. Margaret had seen these men before, or men like them. She had watched Butts drag other fugitives away, seen the casual violence with which he treated human beings who had committed the crime of wanting to be free. She had heard Robinson lecture enslaved people about their duties to their masters, their obligation to accept their lot with Christian resignation. She had watched Marshall search slave quarters, turning over mattresses, breaking furniture, treating people's few possessions like trash. But it was Gaines who haunted her nightmares. Gaines, who had owned her body since birth, who owned her children, who believed with absolute conviction that he had the right to buy and sell human beings like cattle. Gaines, who spoke of slavery as a kindness, who quoted scripture to justify rape, who saw her tears when her children were threatened as proof of maternal affection that made her more valuable, not more human. These were the men who came knocking on the door on January 28th, 1856. These were the men who brought with them chains and shackles and the absolute certainty that they would drag Margaret and her family back to Kentucky, back to slavery, back to a world where children could be sold away from their mothers and wives, from their husbands, and freedom was always just a river away, but might as well be on the moon. Margaret heard their voices through the door, heard Gaines identifying himself, heard Robinson reading the Fugitive Slave Act, heard Butts instructing Marshall to watch the back of the house in case anyone tried to escape. She looked at her children, Thomas standing straight and tall, trying to be brave, Samuel clinging to his father's leg, Mary playing with a corn husk doll, too young to understand, baby Syl, eeping peacefully in her arms. And Margaret Garner made a decision that would echo through history, a choice that was as much an act of love as it was an act of war, as much ultimate surrender as ultimate resistance. The butcher knife lay on the kitchen table, where Margaret had left it after slicing salt pork for breakfast. 8 inches of carbon steel, wooden handle worn smooth by years of use, blade sharp enough to cut through bone. She had used it that morning to prepare what would be her family's last meal as free people. Now she picked it up with the same steady hands that had kneaded bread and braided her daughter's hair and traced letters in the dirt to teach Thomas his alphabet. The knocking on the door grew more insistent. She heard Robert shouting from the front room, heard Elijah Kite protesting that he was a free man with papers to prove it, heard Marshall Robinson's voice cutting across their words, like an axe through kindling. "We have a federal warrant for the arrest of 4 runaway enslaved people. Open this door or we'll break it down." Margaret looked at Mary, her 2-year-old daughter, still innocent enough to smile up at her mother despite the shouting, still young enough to reach out her plump arms, wanting to be held. The child had her father's eyes and her mother's stubborn chin, and she could grow to be beautiful, which in the world they were about to return to was not a blessing, but a curse. What they didn't know was that Margaret Garner had already decided some things were worse than death. The knife came down. It struck with a sound like wet wood splitting, like a tree branch snapping in a storm. Mary's eyes widened in surprise, not pain, and her last word was "Mama," spoken not with fear, but with the absolute trust that mothers know best, that mothers' hands bring comfort even when they bring death. Blood, bright and arterial, spattered Margaret's dress and pooled on the wooden floor. Mary's small body convulsed once, twice, and then went still in her mother's arms. Margaret held her daughter close, feeling the warmth abandon her small body, whispering words of love and apology and promises about a heaven where little girls could run free without anyone chasing them. 1 less, 3 to go. She turned to Samuel, her 6-year-old son, who stood frozen in the corner, his mouth open in a silent scream. The knife rose again, still dripping with his sister's blood, but before Margaret could complete her terrible work, the front door burst inward and Marshal Robinson stormed into the house, his face red with effort and authority. "Stop!" he roared, drawing his pistol. "Drop that knife!" Margaret looked at him with eyes that held no fear, only a deep, exhausting sorrow. "I won't let you take them back," she said calmly. "I'll kill them all before I let you make them enslaved again." Behind Robinson came Butts and Marshall, their eyes taking in the scene. Margaret, standing in the center of the kitchen, her dress drenched in blood, Mary's small body in her arms, the knife still in her right hand. Samuel pressed against the wall, Thomas standing protectively in front of baby Scylla, Robert rushing in from the front room with Elijah Kite behind him. "Jesus Christ," Marshall whispered, making the sign of the cross. "She killed the child." But Margaret was not finished. She lunged at Samuel, the knife arcing through the air, and only Robinson's quick reflexes prevented a second murder. He grabbed her wrist, squeezing until her fingers opened and the knife clattered to the floor. She fought him with the desperate strength of a mother protecting her young, clawing at his face, trying to break free so she could reach her other children. "Shoot me," she gasped, struggling against Robinson's grip. "Shoot me, but don't take them back, please. Don't take them back." Bertie. Margaret's act forced him to confront the humanity he had spent his adult life denying. They loaded the surviving Garners into a wagon like sacks of grain, handcuffing their hands and feet, chaining them to iron rings bolted to the wagon bed. Margaret cradled baby Scylla against her chest, singing a lullaby she had learned from her own mother, a song about a river that led to freedom and a promised land where children could play without fear. As the wagon pulled away from the Mill Creek house, Margaret turned for one last look at the place where she had tasted freedom for 17 days. Blood still stained. The ensuing chaos filled the small house like smoke. Margaret's screams mingled with Samuel's terrified sobs, baby Scylla's crying, Thomas's attempts to comfort his younger siblings. Robert struggled against 2 men trying to shackle him, his face a mask of grief and rage. Elijah Kite protested his innocence while Marshall searched his pockets for evidence of Underground Railroad activity. Neighbors began to gather outside, drawn by the commotion, their faces pressed against the windows as the news spread through the Mill Creek settlement. An enslaved woman had murdered her own daughter rather than return to slavery. Some of the white neighbors nodded with satisfaction. This was what happened when enslaved people were allowed to run wild, when abolitionists filled their heads with impossible dreams of freedom. Some of the black residents wept openly, understanding in their bones the desperation that could drive a mother to such an act. Archibald Gaines arrived as Margaret was being handcuffed. He observed the scene with the cold calculation of a man assessing damaged property. One enslaved child dead and therefore a total loss, one adult enslaved woman who would need to be severely disciplined before being put back to work, 3 remaining children who could still be sold if properly managed. "You've cost me $300, he said to Margaret, as if discussing the weather. "I hope you think your little rebellion was worth it." Margaret looked at him with eyes that held depths of pain and defiance that made him take a step back. "She is free now," she said calmly. "My Mary is free now, and you can never own her. You can never sell her. You can never touch her. By killing her, I loved her more than you could ever understand." The words hit Gaines like a physical blow. He raised his hand to strike her, but stopped, suddenly aware of the crowd watching, of the reporters who had begun to arrive, of the uncomfortable truth in her statement that turned his stomach. He had never thought of slavery in terms of love or freedom, only in terms of profit and Prohi kitchen floor where Mary had died, and Margaret felt no remorse for what she had done, only the pain of not having been able to save them all. The arrest of the Garner family became a sensation that spread far beyond Cincinnati, far beyond Ohio, far beyond the carefully drawn lines politicians had hoped would contain the growing crisis of slavery. Margaret Garner's story appeared in newspapers from Boston to New Orleans, told and retold with different emphases, depending on the politics of the publication and the prejudices of its readers. Northern newspapers portrayed Margaret as a hero, a mother driven to desperate measures by an inhumane system. The Cincinnati Gazette wrote, "This mother's despair reveals the true horror of slavery more clearly than 1,000 abolitionist speeches. What mother would kill her own child unless the alternative was a fate truly worse than death?" Southern newspapers painted a different picture, describing Margaret as an unbalanced woman corrupted by abolitionist propaganda, her actions proof that enslaved people could not be trusted. With freedom that the natural order of things required white supervision of an inferior race, the Louisville Daily Courier declared, "This tragic incident demonstrates the chaos that follows when enslaved people are encouraged to abandon their proper station and pursue impossible dreams of equality." The legal battle that followed Margaret's arrest became a test of federal power versus state sovereignty. Ohio had personal liberty laws intended to protect free black people and runaway enslaved people, but the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 gave federal marshals the authority to override state law and return runaway enslaved people to their masters. Margaret's case would determine whether an enslaved woman could be tried for murder in a free state, or if she remained property to be returned to her master for punishment. The trial began on February 7, 1856, in the crowded courtroom of U.S. Commissioner John L. Penderry. Margaret sat shackled, still wearing the blood-stained dress she wore when she killed Mary, her face a mask of quiet dignity that unnerved onlookers and court officials. She showed no remorse for her actions, no sign of the madness her defenders claimed had driven her to infanticide. Her lawyer, John Jolliffe, argued that Margaret should be tried for murder in Ohio courts, which would at least acknowledge her humanity enough to hold her accountable for her actions. "If she is property, as her master claims," Jolliffe declared, "then she cannot be held accountable for her actions any more than a horse or a cow. But if she committed murder, then she must be human, and if she is human, then she cannot be property. The prosecution, led by Federal District Attorney James H. Chambers, argued that the Fugitive Slave Act was clear. Margaret Garner was property that had been stolen from its rightful owner, and she should be returned regardless of any crime she might have committed while in Ohio. The law recognizes no gradations of humanity, Chambers declared. Either the Fugitive Slave Act means what it says, or federal authority means nothing. Margaret herself was not allowed to testify. Enslaved people could not give evidence in court, but her presence spoke louder than any words. She sat upright and dignified, meeting the eyes of those who stared at her, showing no shame for her actions, no gratitude toward those who claimed to defend her. When asked by reporters if she regretted killing Mary, her answer was simple and devastating. "I would rather see all my children dead than see them return to slavery." The trial lasted 3 weeks and garnered national attention. Spectators packed the courtroom every day, many of them abolitionists who saw Margaret as a symbol of resistance, other curious citizens drawn by the sensational nature of the case. Reporters from major newspapers sent daily dispatches, and the trial records were reprinted in papers across the country. On February 28th, Commissioner Pendry ruled that federal law superseded state law and ordered the Garner family returned to Kentucky. Margaret received the news without emotion, as if she had always known that law and justice were different things, that the system would never choose her humanity over white property rights. But even in defeat, Margaret's story continued to resonate. As the family was transported back to Kentucky on a steamboat, tragedy struck again when the boat collided with another vessel. In the ensuing chaos, baby Scylla was thrown into the icy Ohio River and drowned. Some witnesses claimed that Margaret had thrown the child overboard herself, choosing death over slavery once more. Others insisted it was an accident. Margaret herself never spoke of it, but those who saw her face as she watched her youngest daughter disappear beneath the dark water said she looked like a woman who had finally found peace. Back in Kentucky, Archibald Gaines sold Margaret and her surviving children to different plantations, separating the family as punishment for their escape attempt. Margaret was sold to a plantation in Arkansas, Thomas to a farm in Mississippi, Samuel to a cotton plantation in Alabama. They would never see each other again. Margaret Garner died in 1858, still enslaved, still defiant, still carrying the knowledge that she had saved at least one of her children from a life of slavery. Her story lived on, whispered in the slave quarters, sung in freedom songs, remembered by a community that understood the brutal arithmetic of love and loss that had driven her to such desperate action. Her story spread through underground networks like fire in dry grass. In the slave quarters from Virginia to Texas, mothers looked at their children and understood, perhaps for the first time, that there were fates worse than death, that love sometimes demanded the ultimate sacrifice. Margaret Garner became a legend, a warning, an inspiration, proof that even the powerless could choose their own form of resistance, their own definition of freedom. Her story influenced literature, inspiring Harriet Beecher Stowe to write additional scenes for later editions of Uncle Tom's Cabin, and eventually inspiring Toni Morrison's Pulitzer Prize-winning novel, Beloved, which brought Margaret's story to new generations who otherwise never would have known about the mother who chose death over slavery. In the years leading up to the Civil War, Margaret Garner's name became a rallying cry for abolitionists who argued that slavery was so brutal, so dehumanizing, that it could drive a loving mother to kill her own child. Her story appeared in speeches by Frederick Douglass, in sermons by Henry Ward Beecher, in the writings of William Lloyd Garrison. Today, Margaret Garner is remembered as a symbol of resistance, a woman who chose the only freedom available to her and used it to save her daughter from a life of slavery. Her story reminds us that freedom is not just a political concept, but a deeply personal choice. That sometimes the most powerful form of resistance is the refusal to accept an unacceptable fate. The small house on Mill Creek Road where Mary died still stands, now marked with a historical plaque that tells Margaret's story to visitors who come to understand this dark chapter in American history. The bloodstains have long since vanished, but the memory remains, a testament to a mother's love and the terrible choices slavery imposed on those who lived under its weight. Each blow was not just an act. It was a name reclaimed. Margaret had them, all of them. Her mother Priscilla, her daughter Mary, all of the children sold away from all the mothers who dreamed of freedom, sitting with her in that small kitchen, witnessing her final act of defiance against a system that treated love as a commodity and children as property. Margaret Garner's story forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about American history, about the cost of freedom, about how far people will go to protect those they love. It reminds us that resistance takes many forms, that sometimes the most profound political act is a deeply personal choice, and that the struggle for human dignity never ends. Her legacy lives on in every parent who chooses their child's well-being above their own safety, in every person who refuses to accept injustice as inevitable, in every act of love that defies a system designed to crush the human spirit. Margaret Garner showed us that even in the darkest circumstances, even when every choice is terrible, we still have the power to choose love over fear, dignity over survival, freedom over life itself. If this story has touched you, if Margaret Garner's courage and sacrifice have moved your heart, please subscribe, like and share this video. Her story deserves to be told, her memory deserves to be honored, and her legacy deserves to inspire new generations in the ongoing struggle for human dignity and freedom. Let us know in the comments how her story affects you and what lessons you take from her ultimate act of love and resistance.